Well, yesterday I talked about the Kensington Runestone, and I hope I made a favorable impression. And as I said, Dick and I published our book, The Kensington Runestone, Compelling New Evidence, 3 years ago in November. And immediately after the book came out, what Dick decided to do was go in a little different direction, and I went in a different direction. He wanted to work with the academic scholars. And I'm just going to tell you guys what happened to Professor Henrik Williams after we were in Sweden in 2003, the first time we brought the stone there. He was called into the office of the dean of the college in Uppsala University. And you have to understand, this is the top runologist in the world today. He holds the #1 position. And the dean said, Mr. Williams, if you have enough time to work in the Kensington Runestone, you have time for more work. So he gave him additional administrative duties, and that was a 3-year sentence. And if you know Henrik like I do, that's the last thing in the world that he would want to do. And it was punishment for even, daring to do this. So he's finally done with that. And now he and Dick are working together. They're about ready to publish a paper on the Runestone. And I think it's going to go well. But this is what we're up against. And you guys probably have your own stories, but this is my story. And I got to tell you, I think it's the biggest bunch of crap I've ever seen in my life. But I'm, I run my own business. I'm not beholden to anybody. I can do what I want. But to see people punished and criticized and ridiculed, I don't even know what to say. It's crazy. So anyway, the Kensington Runestone was great. And so now Dick has said, look, I know you're going to talk about, you're going to work on these other things, and you're going to talk about Templars, and I'm going to talk about Knights Templar today. Because from my perspective, they're the only people that I think are the only plausible people that could be involved with these stones, and I'll explain why in a second. But for him to be able to work with Henrik, he could not associate himself with that. Right or wrong, it was the right decision. So I had to go it alone, but I certainly haven't gone it alone. There are a lot of people in this room, Dave Brody. I can't tell you how many people have assisted, and it's been wonderful because, like raising a child, you know that old saying, it takes a village? Well, it's the same thing with this research, and believe me, there are a lot of people that have contributed and continue to contribute, and I welcome any and all input. So, what is it about the runestone that got me curious? Well, what it was this mysterious symbol that you saw, the hooked X. And so the logical place I thought to go was to where there were some other stones found in North America. Minnesota is where I started my journey, and the next stop was to a place called Pompum Beach, which is on the coast of Maine, and about a mile inland to a little place called Spirit Pond. And it was here in 1971 that 3 runestones were found, and this is a picture of the discovery site area, and I'm standing on a man-made dam here that's holding back the water, and it drops a couple, 3-4 feet when the tide is out, and when the tide is up, this area is saline. And right here is where a man who was looking for arrowheads and other artifacts sat down to smoke a cigarette, and he looked down on the ground and he saw a rock sticking out, and it had what looked like characters on it, and he dug them out and he found these 3 stones. Now, I talked yesterday about the stone holes, the triangular stone holes. I was a little bit hurried there at the end. It was my own fault. But I will tell you that I've looked at a lot of artifacts over the last 3 years and sites on the East Coast. And I don't know why, but it seems like at every one of these sites, just about every one of these sites, these holes turn up. And just like at many of these sites, and certainly at the runestone spot, there's a hole right there on the bedrock. This is a bedrock little projection into the water, and it's highly weathered. This is a coarse-grained granitic outcrop right here, and it exhibits very advanced weathering. It does have a triangular shape, just like the other holes, which indicates it was likely made with a straight chisel. Now, is it related to the runestones? I don't know. But, you know, that old association where there's smoke, there's fire, and I have to do this. It reminds me of an analogy my grandfather gave me. He was a Canadian, by the way. My mother was born and raised here. And he said, you know what, Scotty? If there's empty beer cans laying around, there's some drinking going on. I love that line. I'm sorry, but... Walter Elliott was the one that found these stones, and there's a number of people, Sue Carlson, Roz Strong, and other people associated with NERA that knew Walter very well. He was a member of NERA, and I have to tell you that I don't think anybody has seriously said that he was responsible for carving these stones, and there's no way that he was. But anyway, these are the stones. There was also an amulet that was found that has an interesting cross on it. It also has some runes on the back side, but I'm going to focus on the three main stones. This is what we call the Spirit Pond inscription stone. It has the hooked X being used for the A sound, and clearly this is the connection that ties it to the Kensington Runestone, in my opinion. But there's other information, and I'll go through the translation in a second here. This is the back side of the stone. There are 16 lines total, very long inscription. There are pentatic numbers, just like the Kensington Runestone. And I've studied these stones. I actually was given permission to take a small sample. We did some X-ray diffraction work and some elemental mapping. And I can tell you that this is a laminated mudstone comprised of quartz, feldspar, and clay minerals, mostly illite and kaolinite, and halite. Well, being that far from the salt water, there's no surprise there. But the problem with this mineralogy is that basically it's made up of rock that other rocks break down into. So it really doesn't have anywhere to go as far as weathering. And unfortunately, I really can't do much with this. And I hate to say that, but that's the way it is. Here's some of the analysis data here. And because of the high clay content, it's going to be tough to study these. The other thing that's interesting, and I did a very detailed photo study just like I did on the runestone, you see those little holes at the bottom of those word separators? And for those of you that don't know, on these runestones, after they were done making a word or carving a word, they put a 2-dot word separator aligned vertically, and this meant basically we're done with this word, we're starting another one. But you can see these little pinholes at the bottom that are smaller in diameter. Walter said he cleaned out the inscription with a pocket knife. Does that sound familiar? Olaf did the same thing. So anyway, you can decide for yourself, but this tells us that we had an original inscription. Unfortunately, he did a better job than Olaf did, and there really isn't a heck of a lot for me to look at as far as original surfaces. As far as the translation goes, it appears to be a ship's log that, or a report that includes several names either of ships or people's names, or perhaps both, we don't know. There are 3 pedantic numbers. The number 11 appears twice, the number 12, and the number 17 appears twice. And there are 3 Arabic 10s. All these numbers are used on the Kensington Runestone. Unfortunately, because there are not enough word separators, and the reason they probably did this is because many of the phrases were probably common phrases. Whoever the author was of this inscription, probably another Cistercian monk, didn't put in enough word separators really to make definitive translation possible. So I'm not even going to try, and unfortunately many people think they have it translated. I don't believe they're ever going to be able to have it figured out all the way, simply because we just don't know where to separate the runes into words. And there are 3 Easter table dates on this stone. Now, the first analysis that was done by Professor Einar Haugen. I think he was from Harvard University. And one of the first things he said was that the date on this stone, if you look, you can see the word H-A-R is air, year. And then you see these 2 Arabic 10s. And he said that's the year 1010. Well, if it's 1010, he said, there's many words that are very clearly on here, and some of the language can be interpreted. But he said, this is not consistent with this time period. This is much later. And he said, therefore, it must be a hoax. Well, what Einar Haugen did not understand, and nobody's really understood very well, is the use of the Easter table dating method, which we talked about yesterday. Now, when Dick Nielsen looked at this, he said, no, this is year 10th column, 10th row. And then we see what looks to be, in his mind, and I agree with him, 3 U runes immediately afterward. I can tell you there isn't any word in Old or Modern Swedish that's spelled U. I know it looks like an M, but it's a ligature rune where they're tied together. It's called a bin rune. Well, a triple confirmation code would be consistent with the Cistercians, a Cistercian author, and certainly a Templar author. It's confirmed 3 times. When we go to the Easter table, if we go to the 10th column and down to the 10th row, You go across, again, this has been converted to numbers and letter. B is the second letter in the runic alphabet, F, U, thorn, O, R, K, and so forth. And you can see it's the letter U. So that's a confirmation that 1401 is the correct date. By the way, that column, the years are 1392 to 1419, and on the 10th row, that's 1401. There's another date at the end of the the front side of the inscription, year, 10th column, 2 ones is 11. So that's 10th column, 11th row, that would be 1402. Now, these are some really amazing features. And if you look, you'll see there's little bars over these runes. That's an I rune, that's a T rune. Here's an N rune, and then we have a G or a K rune with a dot makes it a G. And we also have a bar over the R. Well, these little characters are much smaller than the Kensington Runestone. And these bars happen to correspond beautifully with the dotted runes found on a few places on the mainland, directly across from Gotland, which is where there was an abbey that fed many of the Cistercian monks over to Gotland. And we see the dotted runes all over Gotland. But on this particular slab at Ukna Church, where they found the dotted R, that was one of the examples I talked about yesterday, 7 of the 8 barred runes appear on just this inscription alone, and they correspond beautifully with the barred runes on the Spirit Pond inscription stone. And I think all it is because these characters are so small that the dots might be confused or missed, and they just used a bar. It was a unique trait, but they correspond beautifully. I don't know how a forger would, first of all, know about these dotted runes, let alone be clever enough to try to be cute here. The A rune, we see the same thing. And on the Kensington Runestone, we have, some of the A runes have double dots we call umlauts, which changes the A sound. And we have the same correspondence on the Spirit Pond, and they're being represented the same way. Another unique feature of this inscription is the use of double voweling. Here we have double A's, and here we have double O's. This is definitely a late medieval feature. How's a forger going to know about this? I don't know. This is the Norway stone, or we call it the Norway stone, and it says Norwegians essentially handed over, and that K might be some type of a code or a symbol for an individual or some company or group that back in those days when they were moving products around, they would take a stick, an ownership tag or a stone, and they'd put it in the barrel or put the stick inside the product. This is mine. And what's interesting here is we have the hooked X, but we have something else that's very, very unique and pretty damn rare too. And it's something called an OR bin rune. Now, many of the skeptics have claimed, oh, they just copied this from the Kensington Runestone. Well, if they copied it from the Kensington Runestone, we have the word Norman. Remember that? Norwegians, N-O-R-R, O-R. Those two runes are separated. Here we have N-O-R, but the O and the R are together in a ligature rune or in a bin rune. You'll also notice that the angle of the bars is going down, and on the runestone they're horizontal. This is not consistent with that theory. And when we go to the island of Gotland at Lea Church, where I found the double dating, in fact this one is double dated as well, we see this same rare bin rune. Here's one example here. Another example right there. This is a very unique and very rare trait. Again, you start to pile up these unique features, the possibility of a forgery really starts to get problematic. The third stone to me is perhaps the most interesting. It's the Spirit Pond Mapstone. And when you look at this area, it essentially corresponds with the geography of where these stones were found. And that one word there, right below the little bay there that you see, is the word hop, which means harbor. Well, again, we have the hooked X. But that word means harbor. And Spirit Pond is about a mile away. You go up the old drainage area there, the river, and you go right into this protective bay. It works beautiful as a harbor. Vinland is on the stone. This is really neat. And then we have the year, 10th column, 11th row, 1402. And then we have a bunch of runes here that basically say, with word separators, that says takes 2 days. And then there's an arrow. You can't quite see it there, but I'll show it to you in a second. Lower right of that third photo, there's an arrow pointing to the right. Takes 2 days. Vinland takes 2 days. Remember that. And then on the bottom, I love this word. It basically means permanent positional situation. This is a map. One thing that's very interesting about this map is that the arrow is pointing to the right, which is south. Well, isn't south pointing down on a map? Well, it is today. It is today. But funny, in medieval times, most medieval maps, the south would be to the right, east would be at the top, and north would be to the left. And that's what we have on this map. That's not consistent with a modern forger. Again, we have somebody who's very well educated. This is an example of one of these 12th century medieval maps. Interesting cross, isn't it? You see that we have Europe and Africa aligned east-west, but we know geographically that's not the case. And in this case, we have Jerusalem as the center of the world, which was a common theme back in those days. Well, let's take a look at the other side of this stone, which is absolutely my favorite. We have another hooked X. And this word that we have spelled out in runes essentially means, I'm told, or Sherwin published in Algonquin, it means Middletaki, or good land. Well, interesting. And then we have a bunch of symbols. We have some plants on either side. Then we have a fish, a duck, a deer, an eel, which is a delicacy of the Norse, I'm told. We have what appears to be a native face, perhaps a native in a canoe. We have a bow and arrow, and we have a skin. And then we have a couple of very mysterious characters at the bottom that, to my knowledge, nobody's ever figured out. Well, I spent some time on this, and I was really intrigued by this symbol because I thought to myself, could this be related to the hooked X? It's not the same, but it's similar. Well, something really amazing happened. Do you remember when I showed you that 15th century manuscript yesterday that had the X symbol for A? An amateur researcher, the second guy you saw in the video, talked about Columbus, Michael Zalar. And he asked me to have lunch one day, and he said, Scott, I found something. And he found the X symbol for A. And then I said, where did you get this? He said, at the University of Minnesota Library, David King, published in 2001. And I said, we're going over there right now. I bought him lunch. I marched him over to the university library. He found the book. I'm a member of the library. I checked it out. And that night I stayed up till about 2 in the morning going through every single page. And on page, I think it was 248, I found something. And it was a picture of a plate from an astrolabe. And I'm telling you, I woke up. My wife, Janet, was sitting next to me, and she had fallen asleep, and her head was on my shoulders, and she wanted me to hurry up and go through the book. I said, no, one page at a time. So she'd fallen asleep, and when I saw this, Janet, she woke up. But if you'll notice, we have that symbol appears 3 times on this plate. And it's being used for the number 40. How clever is that? Combining the Arabic 4 with the Roman 10. And you know it's being used for 40 because if you look on this astrolabe right in the middle there, which is straight up vertical in the sky, 90 degrees from the horizon, you see the L, the Roman L for 50, and then you see our symbol, 90 degrees. Well, I got pretty excited, and then I went on the internet and I started looking at astrolabes. I bought a couple books, and I ended up looking at almost 600 astrolabes. This is the only one that has that symbol out of 600. Now, there might be one out there, but I can't find it. So I decided to go over to see this thing, which was at Oxford Museum of the History of Science. I made an appointment, and on the way, I picked up some stranger who was hitchhiking on the road. He couldn't drive a car worth a darn. I'm sorry, Niven, it was me that was driving. But anyway, that's an inside joke. But I brought Niven with me because you'll find out in a second. And we examined that astrolabe. Every one of these plates has that symbol. And what's interesting is that we found a date. We looked in the literature, and they had a write-up. And you know when this thing was dated to, this astrolabe, when it was made? 1350 to 1400. Apparently, it validates the date, the Easter table date that Dick came up with. I think it does. Well, this is pretty exciting, and I don't know anybody that knows about this, but something else happened. Well, let me tell you about the other thing that everybody was calling a ladder. It's not a ladder. It's a number. Again, this is another style of pentatic number. And if you look in that same book of David King's, this table right here lists a couple of examples of how they use pentatic numbers. It's very simple. It's finger counting. You go a bar all the way across, that's 10. If you go to the right, or excuse me, if you go to the left, it's 5. If you go to the right, it's 1. So look at that. What have you got? 4 bars going all the way across, 4 going to the right, 44. And when I figured that, when I put this together, I went, oh my God. And I ran and I got an atlas. And I said, where were these things found? You'll never guess. Here's Pompano Beach, Spirit Pond. That line of latitude is 44 degrees. And the next one down below is 42, so 43 is roughly in the middle. You know what? That's close enough for me. These things are found at that latitude. So what I think the Mapstone is saying is, here's the map, and on the back side it says this is good land, this is what's here, and this is where it's at. There's no magic there, is there? That was pretty exciting, I have to tell you. There has been some archaeology done there, and I've actually talked to the guy standing in the middle, Ed Lennox, an archaeologist who worked on that dig. There were a couple of trenches that were dwellings that they found, and they dug one of them up. Now I'm not sure, I'm not clear if they did a dig on the second site, but I know they dug the one site. And I read the report and I saw something very interesting. And the way they described these dwellings is they were dwellings that were dug into the hill, and I don't have the terminology down right, but they basically dug a trench and then they put a peaked timber roof. And the roofs had collapsed, and they dated the wood to around 1600. Now, I subsequently learned that there was a settlement attempted at Pompano Beach in 1607. I don't know if I have that right. It was right around that time, but it failed. And of course, we all know about Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, but most people don't know about the settlement at Pompano Beach. It makes me wonder, did they know about that place? And that's the first place they tried to settle? That's a question I don't know the answer. But the one thing that really caught my eye was that they also tested a piece of wood, one of the floorboards from this dwelling, and it dated to 1405, plus or minus 95 years. Well, that date didn't mean anything to anybody after Einar Haugen's opinion, but guess what? Suddenly now it takes on renewed interest, I would think. And I would like to see somebody, any of the archaeologists here, if you can get anybody fired up, you should go back and take a look at this site. I think you'll find something if you look. Well, here are my conclusions. The composition and the retooling of the inscription makes any weathering studies that I might be able to do pretty difficult, at least at this point in time. The inscriptions are dated of 1401, 1402, not 1010. Changes the context of the message. And also, funny, all these features I talked about, everything falls right into place with that time period. It's consistent with it. The texts were clearly not copied from the Kensington Runestone. The barred runes represent the dotted runes, 7 of the 8 on the Astrolabe in Småland, Sweden. The numerous language features are certainly consistent with this time period, 1400s, contemporaneous with the Kensington Runestone for sure. And the orientation with east at the top is consistent with medieval maps. But this is the one here, this is the magic bullet as far as I'm concerned. The geographical accuracy of the Mapstone and the Astrolabe derived latitude of 44 degrees found on one Astrolabe in the whole world that dates to this time period, in my opinion, makes a modern hoax impossible. And so my opinion is they're genuine. And I put some flowery language here, and I worded it this way because this is the way that Newton Winchell wrote his opinion about the KRS, so I'm paying tribute to him. Well, here we are at Spirit Pond. Is there any more? Well, yes there is. There's another inscription down here in Narragansett Bay. And Narragansett Bay is about a 2-day sail from Pompano Beach, with favorable weather, of course. And what do we have? We have a boulder that is still sitting in the surf today that has a runic inscription on it. This picture was taken 2 weeks ago at extreme low tide. And what do you see? The hooked X. The hooked X is what ties these all together. Now, this is a relatively short inscription that has been translated by Dick Nielsen to be "such starvation for men." And there are some really amazing, unique features on this stone. Some people can't even get out of the starting gate with claiming that it was copied from either the Kensington stone or Spirit Pond, because guess what? Of these 9 ruins here, only 3 of them are found on those stones. The rest of them are totally unique. One example I'll give you is, you see the R? Do you see how it comes all the way back and connects with the main stave? That's not found on either of the Spirit Pond or Kensington stones. So the devil's in the details. You got to look at the details, and it'll tell you what's going on. There's another example of the hooked X that showed up in Sweden in 2004, after we brought the runestone to Sweden, the Kensington stone. And this document, I could go on for a long time about this document, but what I'll tell you is that Edward Larson, whose name appears at the bottom, was a tailor. And in 1885, he was a young man who was a member of a tailor's guild. And he was probably a Freemason. And the reason we think he was a Freemason is because neither of these alphabets have been seen before. I just want to point out the X symbol for A, which had never been seen in Sweden before. Here's another example of it. And we have the hooked X in this runic alphabet here. And if you look carefully at those runes, especially towards the tail end of that Futhort, you'll see a lot of hooks on the runes. Now there are other unique features here. These are all ruins that are found on the Kensington Runestone. And of course, what did the scholars do in Scandinavia? Boy, they jumped all over this and said, aha, somebody in Scandinavia could have taken this alphabet and come over to Minnesota and used it to carve the Kensington Runestone. Well, you know what? Close, but no cigar. You remember the magic bullet on the Kensington Runestone, the dotted R? It doesn't appear here. So I guess the point I would like to make here is that this appears to be a Masonic document. It says right here in Swedish, this is the secret style that goes way back. And we talked about this whole culture of secrecy that was going on with these mariners and sailors, and certainly within Freemasonry. But I want you to remember that term, Freemasonry. Do they have secrets? Maybe. The other known example of the hooked X is found in a guy that we're all very familiar with. And as far as I know, I'm the first person, and Dick, to point this out. He has the hooked X in his coded sigla that appears after he came back from the New World. Now you'll notice that, you see all those dots? If you look at those 2 siglas, they're not the same, are they? Remember the dots we talked about in the runestone? Now I don't know if there's a connection here or not, but again, more beer cans, I guess, huh? Interestingly enough, somebody talked about, I don't remember now, that I think it was you, Martin, that said Columbus had the Templar cross on his sails. Well, actually, it's the Knight of Christ sails, which is the order that was founded after the Templars were put down in 1307. Actually, they weren't founded, they just changed their name and went on as usual. And their main seed was at Tomar in Portugal. And you can see the Templar cross to the left, or one version of it, and the Knight of Christ crossed on the right. So we've got a connection here with the Knights of Christ, apparently, with Columbus. And I know that there's people out there who know Manuel Luciano da Silva, who is absolutely convinced that Columbus was a Portuguese. And I think he's probably right. And certainly was a member of the Knights of Christ. His father-in-law was a Grand Master with the Knights of Christ. He absolutely had a map, in my opinion, and I think he knew exactly where he was going. Let's talk about some of the facts. The KRS and Spirit Pond are consistent with the medieval runic record. In other words, there's no reason to believe they're not absolutely genuine. The Narragansett runestone clearly was not copied from the KRS or the Spirit Pond and is very likely medieval. The circumstantial evidence suggests Columbus was likely a member of the Knights of Christ. I'm not saying he was, but I'm saying the evidence suggests he was. The Larson papers contain a secret runic alphabet linked to an 1880s Swedish Masonic Tailors Guild. The X symbol for A was found being used as an alphabetical code. You saw that yesterday, circa 1450. And I want you to look at these dates. Other than the Larson papers, they're all around a similar time period. These are facts. The Cistercians founded the Knights Templar in 1128. The Templars used codes extensively for financial transactions. The Templars had the finest sailing fleet in the world by 1300. Nobody argues with this point, at least not that I'm aware of. The Knights Templar were put down in 1307, and 80 to 90% of the Templar order, along with their ships, disappeared into history. And I've had a lot of historians I've talked to said, they were done after that. Well, logic tells me that if you've got 90 to 80% of your group that's out there somewhere, they don't just die off and disappear. I don't believe that. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to veer from the facts and we're going to start doing some speculation. And once again, it's going to be based on sound historical facts. I'm going to tell you what my interpretations are of the data that I presented and other data. All 5 runestones with the hooked X and Columbus's sigla are medieval. Those happen to be facts, I think, but the Narragansett is speculation on my part. The hooked X symbol appears to be an alphabetical code secretly used by the medieval Cistercians and Knights Templar. That's what I think it is. The 1885 Masonic Guild documents appear to link the hooked X to Freemasonry. And the hooked X likely represents important ideological symbolism. Why? The reason is because it's not found in the record, the runic record. So what is it? Logic told me if these stones are real, then there has to be an explanation for it, right? And if it's not in the record, then maybe there's something else. And this is where I had to switch over to the other side of my brain. And I have to tell you, I struggled with it. But I've had some people who helped me. And when I started talking about the hooked X in my lectures, people started to wait until I was finished and everybody left, and they approached me. They were Freemasons. And they said, I remember the first one, and I went up, he came up to me and I said, "Are you a Freemason?" He said, "Yes." I go, "How did I do?" He goes, "Pretty good." And I said, "Boy, oh boy, I'm really fumbling in the dark." And he said, "Well," he said, "maybe we can give you some help." And they did. Well, there was one other thing that I didn't get a chance to tell you yesterday on purpose about the Cistercians. And this is based largely on what I'm about to tell you now on Alan Butler's work. He was the guy who was standing at Rievaulx Abbey with the ruins behind him. This guy is one brave guy. And I was quietly thinking this with my wife by myself about this story I'm about to tell you. And then when I read one of Alan's books, I felt like I had found a brother. And I sent his website an email and I complimented him on his work. And I said, "Oh, by the way, I'm working with these rocks over here." The next day, I received 2 long emails, and he and I have been going back ever since. And basically what his thesis is, and what I was speculating on, but he's hit it out of the park, is that the Cistercian order, who became wildly successful, and the Templar order back getting into the beginning of the 14th century, who had a fascination for the Virgin Mary, were not fascinated with her because of what the church thought. They had a little different spin on it. I think, and Alan thinks, that they were using the Virgin as a metaphor for their true faith, which was what I call goddess ideology. And if you go back and you look at the records, there's some interesting things that happen. One of St. Bernard's disciples, Pope Innocent II, when he became Pope, I think it was in 1134, he gave a speech that essentially, this is what he argued. He basically said, hey, if Jesus is the Son of God, and of course this is the age-old battle in religion, what is their relative relationship? Aren't they, kind of equal? Well, maybe, maybe not. Well, if Jesus is way up here and the Virgin is his mother, aren't they equal? And this became known in church circles as the Great Heresy. And I haven't read as much as I'm going to about this, but this is a fact that I find very interesting and I think lends support. And I want you to take a close look at this image, because I'm about to tell you what I think the hooked X means. But I want you to notice that the Virgin, or the goddess in this case, I believe, is providing protection equally to both the monks and the nuns, right? Equally. Remember that image and look at her face. This is the most popular image of St. Bernard of Clairvaux. by 2-to-1 in the manuscripts and the carvings is Bernard drinking the milk of the Virgin Mary with Jesus on his lap. And I find this very interesting. I don't know how it went over, but this is apparently a vision that became mythology associated with him, and he became a saint. But I just see something going on here. This is the Virgin or the Mother Goddess nurturing him. And of course, as you know, every abbey and all these cathedrals that they were involved in building are all named after her. And this is where we start to get into this symbolism, and I was trying to understand what it was all about. And I've been educated that when the structures that they built, the nave of the church where people come into worship, represents the womb of the sacred feminine or the goddess. And when you come into church, you're being nurtured in the womb of the goddess. And then you go out into the world. And that ratio is consistent with what they call the sacred ratio, which is a 2-to-1 ratio. There's other ratios here, and I'm sure the mathematics people understand that. But in this case, we're talking about a 2-to-1 ratio. You can see the vesicus piscis there. Do you see those intersecting lines that forms the vertical almond shape? Oftentimes, religious figures are seen within this shape, and that's that 2-to-1 ratio. And of course, you know that's created by intersecting two circles. Some people call that man and woman, heaven and earth, however you want to define it. But that ratio is apparently very important to the Cistercians. I find it interesting that the Kensington Runestone, whoever cut it down to roughly a 2-to-1 ratio. Was this because this ratio was sacred? I'll let you decide. I know what I think. And remember, being nurtured in the womb of the great goddess, and after the service is over and you go back out and are allegorically born back out into the world, how does that happen with a female? You go through the allegorical birth canal, right? That's what that almond-shaped vesicus piscis is. In Christianity, they call it Christ's ascension to heaven. That's what that symbol represents. To the goddess people, it represents being allegorically born through the birth canal of the goddess. So I guess it just depends on your viewpoint, how you interpret this symbolism. But I don't think there's any ambiguity about those doorways. Those are designed after the female genitalia. And this isn't about sex. This is beautiful. This is about birth. And this is all about allegories. And this is the one I just love. When you go into church, this is the womb of the great goddess. And that rose window represents the goddess, Mary Magdalene, the dove. And when the sun, which is considered a male deity, rises in the eastern sky, and the rays of the sun come in, you have the allegorical union of male and female. So in going through this and trying to get my mind properly orientated with this symbolism and these allegories, I went to the Masons, or actually they came to me, and they invited me to speak at their lodge, Grand Lodge in St. Paul, Minnesota on April 25th. And I took them through all this stuff. And then I got to the symbolism, and I said, hey, as I understand it, this is what this part of the symbol means. And again, the A symbol, the X is being used for A, and that's the symbol, the runic symbol that the scholars expected. Well, we certainly don't have that. But if you break the symbolism down, let's just start with the X. And if you cut it in half horizontally, this is basic symbolism. I'm sure most of you understand this. But you have the V symbol, which is the vessel, the chalice, the womb, the symbol for the female. When you flip it around, you have the sword, the phallic, the penis, the symbol for the male. But when you combine them to make an X, you have the allegorical union of male and female, heaven and earth, good and bad, all that stuff, I guess. And I got to this point with the Freemasons, and I looked at them and I said, okay, what's the hook? Help me. I need help. And there was about 150 of them there, and one guy raised his hand. And I said, yeah. And he said, a child? And I looked over at my wife and I went, duh. And she looked at me and she said, Sarah? And then, oh boy, did it get fun. But, you know, and everybody, of course, first thing we thought about was the Da Vinci Code, right? Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and their child. And you know what? That's probably right. In my mind, hey, Men and women get together and have children. I don't care what time you're talking about. That's what I think, but that's me. But I think it's more than that. I think what it is it represents, that little hook represents the continuation, the perpetuation, a generation, if you will, of an ideology, this goddess ideology, and, I believe, a tangible bloodline. But that's me. And I'm sorry that Bill Mann isn't here, because I want to give him I want to thank him too, because I've had some conversations with him around this time, and I shared this with him, and he thought it was pretty good. And then he said something to me. He said, "You know what, Scott? Don't forget about the Egyptians." And the second he said that, I'll never forget it. I was sitting at my office, and I went, oh, something popped into my head. I hung up the phone with him. I said goodbye. I jumped in my car. I drove down to the Midway bookstore in St. Paul. I went to the Egyptian section, and in less than a minute, I found what I was looking for. It was a book on Tutankhamun. What do you see? The crossed crook and the flail, right? One represents the male god Osiris. The flail represents his wife Isis. And when they're crossed in this symbol, they represent kingship, royalty, and the crook carries the eggs, fertility. Is there a connection? Hell yes, come on. I think so. Are you kidding me? What's the goddess ideology? Well, I'm not 100% sure. I think I'm beginning to understand it. But I think that there is a connection, or as Alan Butler says, a golden thread that weaves through time. And this is an ancient religious belief system, and it goes way, way back to when humans first saw women give birth. They are the creators, right? Still are. At least that's what they thought. I used the, hey guys, try this one on your wife. Start calling her the goddess. Works pretty good, let me tell you. And it's true. And she pretends like she doesn't like it, but she does. But I think there is a golden thread, and it goes back before the Egyptians, and it weaves through the Egyptians, the Qumran-Essene, and the Cistercians and the Templars. And this is some of the commonalities. They all wore white for purity. One of the things you'll see in the new book is I went back and I looked at these Egyptian kings. They all wear white, and they have red crosses. Check it out. Is there a connection? I think so. I don't have a picture. I should have thrown one in. They all practice ritual bathing. Remember those lavatoriums in the Cistercian abbeys? Very important to them. Same with the Qumran-Essene and the Egyptians, the cult of Isis worshippers. They had elaborate initiation ceremonies. I know there's some people in the room that understand that. They also tended to large flocks of sheep. The sheep are one of the primary reasons the Cistercians became so wealthy, and certainly the Essene did, and you go back to the Egyptians, you see the same thing. They were associated with military orders. This is another commonality. And they closely tracked the movement of Venus. There's some guy in the room, I think it's going to talk about Venus later on in a different context. I can't wait. But I asked myself a question. Could there be a connection to Freemasonry that would continue on after that Cistercian Templars? I think so. Let's talk about Venus for a second. The cycles of Venus. This planet has long been associated with love, sex, reproduction, and restored life. She was the manifestation in the heaven of the goddess. The planet Venus was very important, and the ancients tracked the movement of Venus along with the other heavenly bodies, as many of us know. And there's a very defined cycles that Venus has. One of them is the 8-year cycle. And what happens, and I want to give credit here to Ashley Cowie. He was the guy that said it must now be requestioned. And I had an opportunity to meet him when I went to see Niven and visit Rosslyn earlier this year. And he talks about Venus, and I've looked into Venus, and this is his graphic. But basically, during its 8-year cycle, Venus spends 4 years of time as an evening star, rising in the western sky, getting to an altitude of about 22 degrees. Who was it that had an angle of 22.5 degrees? Somebody had that angle. I wanted to jump on that, but I wanted to wait until I got this. Something you might want to look into. And then it spends 4 years as a morning star in the east-southeastern sky. And it rises, and when it sets every day, it makes a horn. And when it's a western star, an evening star, it makes a horn that's opposite. These are called the horns of Venus. And you see this symbol all over the place in ancient iconography. Here's Isis with the horns of Venus, and you have the sun disk, the male god, in the middle. Could this be the allegorical union of male and female going back to then? I think so. But if you think about the Venus, the other thing that it does during its 8-year cycle, if you track its actual movement relative to Earth, it makes a 5-pointed star. This is an ancient symbol that's been seen going back to standing stone sites thousands of years ago. And they're seen, as far as I understand, all over the world. So people were tracking Venus, no question about it. But in Christianity, we know that the pentagram, the 5-pointed star, represents what? The devil, right? Well, why would it be in a northern window here at Amiens Cathedral in France? Do you see that? If it's a symbol of the devil, why is it there? I don't know. But it's interesting that that point, it's pointing down, right? What do you see in that little glowing window at the bottom? You see an equilateral triangle, which is the pubic triangle, the symbol of the goddess, where life comes from, right? Is there a connection? I don't know. Decide for yourself. And there's many other cycles, a 40-year cycle and other cycles. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they use Venus as a calendar and a clock, and it's amazingly accurate. But there's another structure that I want to talk about. Remember, we went from Minnesota to Spirit Pond down to Narragansett Bay. And on the other side, the eastern side of the bay, there's this stone structure, 2-story round structure. I'm sure most people in this room know what it is. It's called the Newport Tower, the Mystery Tower. And nobody knows when it was built. Some people think it's a colonial window or a windmill. I don't. There are a lot of things you can talk about, and there's many people who have done some really good research on the tower with the architecture. Jim Woodall, I want to mention his name. He's done a lot of great work. Sue Carlson, many others. But the architecture is clearly Templar, no doubt about it. And this goes back to the 2-storied tower on top of the Christ tomb in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where the Templars were. When they came back, they started building round churches. I've seen them. Niven knows all about them. Many people do. But this is the architecture that is clearly Templar, and the Romanesque arches, the round tower, the octagonal footprint, the twin fireplace flues found in northern Scotland, castles. And there's also astronomical alignments. And the person who's really helped me understand these is Bill Penhallow in Rhode Island, retired professor of physics and astronomy. And he's documented many solar and lunar alignments. Oh, I'm getting there. But there's more. I asked myself, after going through all this research and trying to understand how these people's minds worked, and if there was something to this, could there be Venus alignments? Well, I tell you what, if this is a Templar structure, there had better be Venus alignments. That's what I thought. And I'm not an astronomer, but I know a little bit about math. And there is some interesting things inside this tower. There are a couple of windows up at the top. You see that little window at the top in the southeast window? And there's one to the west. And in Bill Penhallow's work, he did not have an account for these windows. And inside the tower, there are niches. And he accounted for all the niches in the windows except for 2. And they happen to correspond with what I'm about to show you. When Venus reaches its maximum height in the sky as a morning star in the southeastern sky, the light will go through that window and it will hit a niche on the inside, western inside part of the tower. Bill did not account for that niche. Conversely, on the west side, if the light of Venus, when it reaches its maximum, which is about 22.5 degrees, 22, 23, it'll hit a niche on the inside. This is a diagram showing those 2 niches and how the light of Venus would go through. Bill's looked at this work, and he says there's some consistency there. It looks pretty good. There's something else that happens, and I want to give credit to Jim Egan, who last fall gave a talk at the Newport Tower Symposium, and he took photographs inside the tower and noticed that on the winter solstice, the sun hits this interesting keystone on the inside. And I'm just showing you the angle. After a solar alignment happens going through the south window, through the west window, this is Bill Penhallow's work, that light box keeps going as the sun rises. Now, as far as I know, I'm the first person to notice this. I don't know if there's anyone else. Let me know. I'll give them credit. But there are two very prominent, interesting keystones in the same archway in the tower. And they are clearly Masonic. And of course the Templars might be connected to Freemasonry. I think so. This is called the Orphic Egg. And I want to thank some Freemason friends for helping steer me in the right direction. And you know what they told me? One guy in particular, Peter Tomlinson, he said, you know what, Scott? If you're worthy of knowing, you'll figure it out on your own. And I did. But I want to give him credit for steering me in the right direction. But I found it on my own. And this is what happens on that keystone, which is shaped like an egg, the Orphic egg in Freemasonry. Watch what happens to that light box. Holy cow, I just love that. I was pretty excited. What's going on here? Well, the sun is considered a male deity, right? And that round church is considered a womb by these goddess worshippers. And the Orphic egg is on the inside of the tower. It's in the womb of the great goddess. And what we have on the shortest, darkest day of the year, the allegorical union, once again, of male and female. I think. This is my interpretation. And I think what's happened is that egg is being fertilized. And now we have the progression to spring, right? And on the equinox, maybe we have the allegorical birth of what I think is the goddess ideology that the Templars and the Cistercians attempted to bring here around 1400. On the outside, there's another keystone in the same archway. They're back to back. And if you look at that shape of that keystone, that's another Masonic keystone. It's the Mark Master Mason shape. And back in medieval times, the Master Mason was given the honor of putting in the final keystone to tie in the structure. And it was, he carved a very special keystone that had the notches at the top. Now this is rough stone, but it's basically that same shape. I want you to notice that round red granite orb sitting directly on top of that keystone. Very symbolic. And you know what color the planet Venus is when it rises through the atmosphere? Red. So one day I was standing there looking at that keystone on the outside. And I'm telling you, I went like this. I said, "What's up with you? What are you pointing at?" Oh. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. You cannot make this up, because I went back and I did the calculations, and that angle, I'm not going to take you through it, is 17 degrees. If you start right in the center of that tower and you draw a line directly through both of those keystones, and by the way, they're not centered in the middle of the archway, and I guarantee you no self-respecting stonemason would do that. So what does that mean? It means it's off for a reason. It means something. Well, I got out a map and I started drawing lines again, and this is what happened. You can't make this one up. Now, that's pretty nuts, isn't it? Well, you remember that round orb? Maybe when it rises every night, when it's an evening star, they've got the beacon right there, and it's about that angle. I don't know if that's right. But I will say this. There are a bunch of stone holes in that little hexagonal pattern you see there. And basically what I think they did, these stone holes that we find all over the upper Midwest and at the farm, is I think the keystones were pointing the way to that land claim stone, because you got to find it again, right? And once they got in the general area, they start finding the stone holes, and I'm sure they had a method to get them to the farm area, and then they were reeled in and they could find that stone. That's my thesis. I don't know if it's true, but I'm going with it. So we come all the way back to Minnesota. But I have one final question. Who could be involved in this? Well, I've looked back and talked to historians, and there's only one person that whose name keeps coming up that could possibly be associated with this stuff on the East Coast. And I'm serious. And I got to tell you, I didn't start off as an advocate for the Sinclair clan, but I don't have anybody else to work with. So there's this guy. Could it be him? Well, so I started looking at him. This guy reportedly sailed to the New World. Well, okay, that's interesting. Here's some facts. Hugh Dupanion married Catherine Sinclair, member of the clan, in 1119. Hugh Dupanion was one of the original 9 knights. He's a Templar. Well, there's a connection. Henry Sinclair of Rye became Cistercian abbot at Lawrence. Cistercian. 1146, and at Melrose. In the video, you saw me talking, I was standing at Melrose. There's a connection. The Sinclairs of Rosslyn reportedly were the hereditary Grand Masters of the Knights Templar Freemasons for centuries. Well, there's a connection. The Sinclairs intermarried with Scandinavian royalty for centuries. Could maybe they have gotten word through the Norse about the New World? Well, come on. Here's some more beer cans. We're throwing more beer cans. And Henry's grandson, William Sinclair, built Rosslyn Chapel in 1446. Well, what about Rosslyn? I got to go check it out. Maybe there's something there. And Niven, you and I have talked about this. The windows on the outside at Rosslyn have designs carved at the top of the windows. This engrailed X, of course the engrailing is this part of the Sinclair family crest. And this is in an X symbol. And I kept looking at this. There are 4 of them. It's the most, there are 4 of them. And that's the most common symbol you see outside the window. And I believe it represents the same symbology as the hooked X. But wouldn't it be cool if we found like my hooked X? Of all the places in Europe, this is amazing. Niven, you were there on that pillar, two pillars away from the apprentice pillar. I just can't believe this. That's the hooked X. Now, there is a little modification. You see that little lozenge at the bottom. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but if you go down into the crypt, you take a right on the walls. I think it's leading on the left side as you lead into one of the crypts. There's an interesting drawing that's carved into the walls. And it looks very old to me, I'll tell you that. And Ashley Cowie's written a book on this. But there's lozenges here, and he says they correspond to latitude. And they do correspond to latitude. And I'm going to take you through it in a minute here if we have time for questions. But see these horns? Do you see those horns on the left side? He thinks those correspond to the horns of Venus. I think he's absolutely right. And if you look on the left side, you see a 5-pointed star. So I think that's a representation in the eastern sky. So that lozenge underneath my hooked X may be a symbol for latitude. I don't know what it means yet, but we just found this in April, right, Niven? Well, this whole goddess thing in Freemasonry, that's something I'm looking into really hard right now. You all know that our country was founded by Freemasons, right? Essentially. And this goddess ideology, what happened to it? Did it survive? Well, I'm beginning to learn that once you understand what to look for, you'll see it all around you. It's all over the United States of America. And an interesting thing at the top of the Capitol, which if you look down Pennsylvania Avenue on the summer solstice, we did this year, the sun sets right on the White House, on that alignment. And I've been told, I haven't seen it yet, that Venus also rises, and the president can see it going right through the Capitol there. And you know what's sitting on top of that building, our Capitol in the United States? Does anybody know? I don't know who she is, but it's a woman. That's all I know. And if you look at her headdress, that headband she has, do you see those 5-pointed stars? Venus, maybe? Goddess, maybe? What is arguably the most visible symbol of the United States to the world? Well, the dollar. That's a good one. Oops, that's a good one. But I want to point one more thing out to you guys. I don't know how many people have noticed this, but you know that book she's holding? Do you see those notches? See that somewhere else? Isn't it weird how these connections keep coming? But, you know, when I look at this statue, it reminded me of something. The goddess. That's what I think it is. I don't know. Am I onto something or am I on something? Thank you. Hey, one last thing. This is so cool. Okay? Now, these lozenges that he was talking about, okay? There's an old exercise the Egyptians used to do. And they take a staff, a rod, and make a circle in the sand. They take a rod here, they put a rod here, and then, you know, when the sun rises in the eastern sky. It rises in the eastern sky, and on the summer solstice, it rises at its northernmost point in the eastern sky, right? Okay? So this is on the solstice, summer solstice. And of course, in the winter, on December 21st, my birthday, my wife says the longest or the shortest, darkest day of the year. The winter solstice, same thing, okay? Now what they do is that when the sun, and this happens at a particular latitude, when the sun rises on the summer solstice, it will cast a shadow on our stick across this circle, like that. And the sun will rise and it'll set in the west, and then it will cast a shadow back this way, okay? And then in the winter solstice, you do the same thing. It's down in the southern, it casts its light and it goes like this, and then it sets, and then it goes like that. Okay? Now, if you connect these, you get what? Where do you think, what latitude do you think that happens at? Jerusalem. Okay? That's a fact. Now, this angle right here is 60 degrees, and it makes a lozenge, okay? That's what is in Rosslyn Chapel. It corresponds to latitude. Now, as you go north, okay, and I forget the latitude, what is it, 33 or something? I don't know what it is. But anyway, as you go north, of course, the sun sets progressively farther north in the eastern sky, right? So as you go north and you do this exercise, your shadow is going to be cast at a higher angle, okay? What do you, and so that corresponds to, at low latitude, your lozenge is like this, and as you go higher, it gets taller. Okay, you with me on that? Everybody following along? Okay. What do you think the shape is of the lozenge at Rosslyn? A perfect square. Okay? Now, how many people recognize this symbol? And you Freemasons, be quiet. Give you a little clue. This angle, 60 degrees. This angle is 90. Could it be? And if there's a connection between Freemasonry and the Templars, and when I say Templars, I'm talking Templars, Cistercians, Teutonic Knights, Knights of Christ. It's an ideology. It's a mindset. Well, this would make sense then, wouldn't it? I'll let you decide for yourself if that makes any sense. Oh.
I want to add a couple of quick things. When you talk about north being south, in a traditional understanding, in a spatial view outside of the Earth, the South Pole is up. That's the top of the world, not the north. In a spatial, when you're outside, the heavy part of the Earth is what's called the North Pole. Okay, so it is up, is south. Okay. And when you talked about the birth canal, things like that, those are traditional stories of creation. All go back to the passage of birth all the way through. But the Masons, when you say Freemasonry, I would qualify that to say, because Freemasonry didn't start until the Masons had all left Europe. Really? 1717, it's too late. They had all gone. That's why there were no Masons left. They had all come over here. All our early families that came over here were all Masonic. Not Freemasonic, but yet they still came back into Freemasonry, and my families were Grand Masters for Upper and Lower Canada. But you have to qualify that, because there was internal battles with the American Freemasons that came over. They had their own ideas, okay? And they had the same symbolism, the same things, but they did not have the same loyalty as the Templars did to the families. And that's been the challenge here in North America.
I personally think that a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about, this goddess stuff, I think within Freemasonry, some of this has been lost. And this is part of the reason why I think there's been a really positive reaction by many Freemasons, at least where I live. And some of them, there's only a few that say, hey, yeah, I get that. Most of them go, I didn't know that. So some of this, I personally think, is information that's been lost. And it's coming out again. So, but it sounds to me like some of the native people kind of had it figured out all along.
Guys, we're going to allow time for Michael Thrasher, so maybe 2 more questions, and that's going to wrap it.
Okay, thank you. I'll stand up. You've presented to us some very interesting pieces of a pretty grand puzzle. And your slide that showed the 4 lozenges, and you've talked about 2 of them here today. And you made some your choice with Prince Henry Sinclair, and you alluded to his Norse connections. Do you have any, because it looked like one of the lozenges that you showed was smaller than a square. Yeah. Have you thought about going further north into and finding what is there?
Haven't fleshed that out yet, but yes, I definitely, because that lozenge is taller than the latitude at Rosslyn. So, you know, if we're talking about the runestone, let's say, that trip probably started from somewhere, may have started in the Baltic Sea, but for whatever reason, that lozenge represents a higher latitude. And I don't know what it means, but yes, I've thought about it, and I haven't developed it yet, but if anybody has any ideas, fire away. I'm open.
I was just wondering if you'd taken the time to measure the angles and
yes.
thereby have a known...
Trondheim is one area that would be, but you know, you're talking about a relatively rough carving, and so you know, you have to, but it's that would be the closest major port.
Last question.
Yeah.
Here, I'll pass the microphone to whoever's speaking.
I'm sorry?
Regards to the tower.
Okay.
Ask your question again.
Yeah. I've been out with Jim Whittall and others inside that tower many times, and particularly the change of the seasons. Now, when you took that photograph, was that on the winter solstice?
Yes. That was last winter I took those pictures.
We've been there the day before, the day of, and the day after. And where the sun strikes is a little different. It does not hit that stone the way you showed it in that photograph.
Well, that was actually, this year it was, the solstice was actually on December 22nd, and that was the morning of December 22nd.
But being out there in March, which is 9 months from Christmas, I find that very interesting.
Gee, what takes 9 months? Hey, that's a good one to end on right there. Thank you.